The major sections of the brain include cerebrum, which has two cerebral hemispheres, cerebellum, which is located on the posterior side of the brain, so that helps me to differentiate anterior of brain from posterior. We also have brainstem, which is divided into three sections, but as you see, brainstem is the most inferior part of the brain, and that's the one that actually is fused to spinal cord. Please note, spinal cord is not part of the brain. Brain and spinal cord together would be referred to as central nervous system, CNS. And then deep inside, above brainstem, we have diencephalon, which I walk you through these four major parts of the brain, including cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and diencephalon. First, I start with cerebrum. As you can see, the two cerebral hemispheres are divided by a fissure that is called longitudinal fissure. This is the most prominent fissure that we have in brain. Also, we have a fissure that separates cerebellum from cerebrum. That would be referred to as transverse cerebral fissure. Recall that layers of dura mater, which is the outer meningeal layer of brain, extend deep inside the two fissures that I just talked about. We name that part of dura mater that extend deep inside longitudinal fissure falx cerebri, and we name the part of dura mater that extend deep inside the transverse cerebral fissure tentorium cerebelli. On each cerebral hemisphere, we have lots of these elevations, which we refer to them as gyra. When I look at the lateral side of the brain, I identify a sulcus, a groove right here, which is called central sulcus. So here I'm pointing out the central sulcus of both cerebral hemisphere. The goal is to divide each cerebral hemisphere into 5 lobes, and in lateral view we can easily see 4 of those 5 lobes. We can see frontal lobe, which clearly is the lobe that sits close to frontal bone, and posterior to frontal lobe we have parietal lobe. Central sulcus is the sulcus that divides frontal lobe from parietal lobe. And I would like you to pay attention to 2 gyra, the one that sits in front of central sulcus and is referred to as precentral gyrus, and the one that sits posterior to central sulcus. This is postcentral gyrus. The importance of precentral gyrus would be, this is the place that we look for primary motor cortex. When we say primary motor cortex, we mean those neurons that they send signal down to eventually stimulate skeletal muscle contraction. Basically, those neurons that control the voluntary movement of our body are located in precentral gyra, in the primary motor cortex. The neurons that we have in postcentral gyra would be referred to as primary somatosensory cortex. Basically, the neurons here receive signals about some sensory information such as touch, vibration, pain, temperature, whether it's cold or warm, itching, tingling, and position of our joints and skeletal muscles. Brain constantly should be aware of what is going on in our skeletal muscles and joints to determine what type of movement we need to move our body parts purposefully. From frontal lobe and parietal lobe, I move here to temporal lobe. For example, one important thing about temporal lobe is that if we're looking for primary auditory area that enable us to hear sounds, we have to look for them in temporal lobe. And in the medial wall of temporal lobe, we can find olfactory cortex. Olfactory cortex obviously is the one that enables us to smell different odorant molecules. Deep to frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. So deep inside, we have a smaller lobe that is called insula. For example, in insula, we find gustatory cortex, the neurons that receive signal about taste molecules. They enable us to detect taste. And then finally here, we can see occipital lobe. If I want to say one important thing about occipital lobe would be that in occipital lobes, we're looking for primary visual cortex. Those neurons that receive the visual impulses, basically they enable us to see. In separate videos, I walk you through different areas that we find in cerebral cortex, but at least in this video, we learned one important thing about each one of these lobes, and we'll learn about a few of these areas. Please keep in mind that the two cerebral hemispheres should be connected together. So when I go deep inside longitudinal fissure, exactly in the floor of longitudinal fissure, I'm supposed to find some myelinated axons that connect the two cerebral hemispheres together. When we say myelinated axons, we are emphasizing that they are very fast in transmitting electrical impulse. Basically, they allow the two cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another. To show you those myelinated axons that connect the two cerebral hemispheres together, I have to cut and open through longitudinal fissure. Basically, I need to show you a mid-sagittal view of the brain. Here we have a mid-sagittal view of cerebrum, and as I promised, I go deep inside longitudinal fissure, and exactly when I get to the floor, I see the largest band of commissural fibers, which is referred to as corpus callosum. In corpus callosum, we find about 300 million fibers. So that would be one of the structures that allow one cerebral hemisphere to send signal to the next. And also here I can see anterior commissure, and right here I see posterior commissure. So these three together make connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. And now that I'm deep inside one of the cerebral hemispheres, please note this is the right cerebral hemisphere, I can locate the right lateral ventricle. Recall in brain we have 4 ventricles, and inside each cerebral hemisphere we can find one of the first 2 ventricles that we name them lateral ventricles. Between the 2 ventricles we have a partition that is called septum pellucidum. It's easy to remember. Septum means wall, means partition. In lateral ventricle, we do find choroid plexus. Recall choroid plexus would be some blood capillaries that are covered by ependymal cells. Filtration of blood in these blood capillaries happen. Ependymal cells receive part of the plasma that is filtered and then secreted into the space that we have inside the lateral ventricle, and we name that secretion cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid has many different functions, including sending nutrients and oxygen to the neurons and collecting their waste. So that would be how much we can talk about cerebrum in this model. Now I walk you through diencephalon. This section that I'm pointing at is diencephalon. 80% of diencephalon would be thalamus, so I'm pointing at the right side of thalamus, and exactly that dark area that I'm pointing at, that's interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass that connects the 2 sides of thalamus together. Please note between the 2 sides of thalamus, exactly the space that I'm pointing at, that would be 3rd ventricle. 3rd ventricle is connected to each lateral ventricle through a foramen that is supposed to be somewhere here, named interventricular foramen. As you notice, in 3rd ventricle we have choroid plexus, means in 3rd ventricle we have production of cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid that is produced in lateral ventricle through interventricular foramen gets inside the 3rd ventricle. Here we have more production of this fluid, and then from 3rd ventricle we allow this fluid to flow through this long pathway that is called aqueduct of midbrain to get inside the last ventricle, which is called 4th ventricle. But before I walk you through the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, let's clarify that aside from 3rd ventricle being located between the 2 sides of thalamus, it is important to note that thalamus is the grand station of the brain. What does it mean? It simply means many important signals should pass through thalamus. For example, I'm sure that we all recall the central sulcus, and we know that the gyrus that sits in front of central sulcus is precentral gyrus, And here we have the primary motor cortex. So imagine we want to have a voluntary body movement from the neurons in primary motor cortex. Signals should be sent down, and when we follow these signals, we see that they have to pass through thalamus. Then from thalamus, they can continue through the white matter of brainstem and eventually get inside spinal cord. Also, when we send sensory information to the brain, which, as I mentioned, we're trying to send the sensory information to post-central gyrus because that's the place that we have primary somatosensory cortex. Those signals will be sent through spinal cord, brainstem, and eventually they have to pass through thalamus. If you imagine an eyeball here, the visual signals from eyeball should eventually get in occipital lobe because primary visual cortex is here. However, those visual signals must pass through the thalamus. Even auditory signals from inner ear should pass through thalamus before they can get to the temporal lobe, the primary auditory cortex. So these are just a few examples that in general, many important signals should pass through thalamus in order to reach another section of the brain, or from spinal cord and other part of the brain get to cerebrum. And please keep in mind that thalamus also has a role in emotion. It's been proved that when we recall something and we have emotion toward recalling that information, there are some activities noticeable in some of the nuclei in thalamus. From thalamus, when I move anterior and a little bit inferior, I can find hypothalamus, very small section of the diencephalon, but it has significant role. Hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. It's involved in our emotions, so we say that hypothalamus is also part of our limbic system, emotional brain. This is the thermostat of our body. Basically, it has a significant role in thermoregulation. Our eating center, drinking center, both are located in hypothalamus. Also, hypothalamus is the one that is considered our biological clock. If you think about the question why human is designed to sleep when it's dark and stay awake when there is light during daytime, most of the answer will be related to the function of the nuclei that we have in hypothalamus. So many important roles. And also, let's not forget that that's hypothalamus that by releasing some important hormones controls secretion of hormones from pituitary gland. From thalamus, when I move posteriorly, I can locate epithalamus. The only section of epithalamus that I see in this model is pineal gland, or we can say pineal body. That's the one that releases melatonin to make us sleepy. However, please note in epithalamus, we also have some other nuclei, such as habenula nuclei, that they are involved in the emotions that we have toward different odorant molecules. So these are three important sections of diencephalon: epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. Now I can walk you through the brainstem, which we know the upper part of brainstem is midbrain. The middle part of brainstem, which in human brain, this part sits right in front of cerebellum, that would be pons. And the lower part of brainstem, the most inferior section of brainstem, is medulla oblongata. I start with midbrain. There are many important nuclei in midbrain. The ones that I see in this model, I find them as two elevations on the posterior side of midbrain. We call this superior colliculus, and the other elevation is inferior colliculus. Please note we have a pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi. The neurons that we have in superior colliculus are the ones that enable us to have the scanning motion of our eyes. For example, when you are moving your eyes to follow a moving object like a moving car, or when you're reading a sentence. The neurons that we have in inferior colliculus are the ones that allow you to respond to what you hear. For example, if you hear a loud gunshot, you have a sudden movement. Now, if you think about it, in general, superior and inferior colliculi allow us to respond to what we see and what we hear. So in a way, we can say that these colliculi of midbrain enable us to be aware of our surrounding. As I mentioned, from third ventricle, when we want to go to fourth ventricle, we have to walk through aqueduct of midbrain, or some resources refer to this as cerebral aqueduct. When we get to fourth ventricle, obviously in the wall of fourth ventricle we have choroid plexus, so we have more production of cerebrospinal fluid. Please note, in human brain, fourth ventricle sits exactly between pons and cerebellum. The cerebrospinal fluid eventually has to get inside the central canal of spinal cord and also subarachnoid space of brain and subarachnoid space of spinal cord. Basically, in fourth ventricle, we should find three openings named median aperture in the middle and two openings on the side named lateral apertures. Through median and lateral apertures, cerebrospinal fluid eventually gets inside the central canal of spinal cord and subarachnoid space of central nervous system. So that would be how cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the choroid plexuses of all four ventricles and how it circulates. In midbrain, we do have some other nuclei. Unfortunately, we don't see them, but recall in midbrain we have substantia nigra that communicates with the basal nuclei of cerebrum. We also have red nuclei here that are involved in precise movements that we have in the most distal part of our limbs. Specifically, we're talking about digits. In pons, we do have a variety of nuclei, including pontine respiratory center. And let's note that in medulla oblongata, we have also medullary respiratory center. Basically, medullary respiratory center and pontine respiratory center together try to adjust the rhythm of our breathing to what we need. Also in pons, we do have some nuclei that whenever primary motor cortex sends signal down, that we know this signal should go to spinal cord, those nuclei allow those signals to be sent to cerebellum. As you can see, cerebellum sits exactly posterior to the pons. Basically, those nuclei of pons are trying to make sure that every time cerebral cortex sends an order to the skeletal muscles to make them contract, cerebellum gets a carbon copy of that message. When skeletal muscles contract from tendons, ligaments, and joint capsules, signals will be sent up through spinal cord to medulla oblongata. In medulla oblongata, we have some nuclei named olive nuclei. They analyze the reality of skeletal muscle contraction and joint movement and create an instruction and send the instruction to cerebellum. So please note, cerebellum has a carbon copy of the message that primary motor cortex sent down to skeletal muscles and also receives the information about the actual muscle contraction. The neurons in cerebellum make a comparison between how muscles reacted to the order that brain sent down, and if muscles did not do exactly what brain wanted them to do, which in most cases that's the case, then the cerebellum send some feedback to the motor cortex of the brain. Think about the feedback that cerebellum send as some sort of feedback that you guys need to develop a new order, but make this adjustment in your orders and send the order down. And please keep in mind that when primary motor cortex send the new orders down toward the skeletal muscles, pons make sure that cerebellum receives a carbon copy of the message, and when medulla oblongata receives information about the actual muscle contraction and joint movement, medulla oblongata also makes sure that cerebellum receives this information. So that allows cerebellum to make a comparison between what muscles did and what brain wanted them to do and create a proper feedback to help motor cortex to regulate and coordinate our body movement. From pons, I move down to medulla oblongata. First thing that I notice is in the anterior of medulla oblongata, we have an elevation. We call that pyramid. Please keep in mind right now I'm pointing at the right pyramid. To know exactly how pyramid forms, we have to go back again to primary motor cortex. From primary motor cortex, we use a very thick fiber tract, which is a motor fiber tract, that sends signal down to spinal cord. We name that fiber tract that starts in cerebral cortex and ends in spinal cord corticospinal fiber tract. Obviously, it passes through thalamus, it passes through white matter of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. When it gets to medulla oblongata, in the anterior of medulla oblongata, corticospinal fiber tract creates two elevations, which we refer to them as pyramids of medulla oblongata. And it is important to note that when corticospinal fiber tracts get to medulla oblongata, exactly above where medulla oblongata fuses to spinal cord, 90% of each corticospinal fiber tract crosses and goes to the opposite side. So if I go back to the anterior view, imagine the right primary motor cortex sends signal down, signals get to eventually medulla oblongata, and here 90% of this fiber tract goes to the opposite side, to the left side. So the left muscles are going to receive this signal. First of all, we name exactly the spot that 90% of each corticospinal fiber tract crosses and goes to the opposite side, decussation of pyramid. That explains why each side of the brain controls the contraction of muscles in the opposite side, which that's very important when we are diagnosing problems. For example, if a patient had stroke and you see that the patient has difficulty in moving the right body part, the stroke more likely happen in the left side. So that's one thing about pyramid and decussation of pyramid. Medulla oblongata obviously is the one that is fused to spinal cord, and if you think about the location that these two are fused together, we notice that it's very close to foramen magnum of skull. So this area should be carefully protected, mostly because in medulla oblongata we have the neurons that they control our breathing, the basic rhythm of our breathing. In a simple way, I can say that our breathing depends on the neurons that we have in medulla oblongata, medullary respiratory center. Also in medulla oblongata, we have the neurons that control the function of the heart, how forceful heart has to contract, how many numbers of beats heart has to have. The neurons here also control the diameter of the blood vessels, and as a result, they can control also the blood pressure. So these neurons that control the activity of heart and the blood pressure would be referred to as cardiovascular center. Also in this very small section of the brain, we have the neurons that enable us to have some important reflexes such as swallowing, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, vomiting. So very small section of the brain, but significant role. Before I switch back to the external view of the brain, let's note that in the entire brainstem, basically all three sections, we have a very large group of sensory and motor neurons that we refer to them as reticular formation. In reticular formation of brainstem, we have reticular activating system. One very important function of reticular activating system would be consciousness. Damage to reticular activating system places that individual in coma. We name reticular activating system of brainstem also the attention center of the brain. In cerebellum, which right now I am pointing at the right cerebellar hemisphere, in each hemisphere we have three lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and flocculonodular lobe. All these lobes are involved in regulating and coordinating body movement. And it is important to note that cerebellum is connected to brainstem by three pairs of groups of myelinated axons named cerebellar peduncles. In this model, it's difficult to differentiate the three cerebellar peduncles, but it is good to note that we have superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. As I mentioned, these are groups of myelinated axons that allow cerebellum to communicate with the rest of the brain. When you focus on the dark area in cerebellum, which would be the gray matter, those ridges of gray matter would be referred to as folia, but the white branches, which are myelinated axons, we name them arbor vitae. The two cerebellar hemispheres are connected together by a central portion, which is called vermis. Please note that half of the neurons that brain contains are located in cerebellum, and the only activity of cerebellum is not coordinating body movement. cerebellum also has a role in activities such as cognition, language processing. So there is more to learn about cerebellum. Now what I do, I put the two sides of the brain together because we need to analyze the inferior section of the brain and a little bit talk about the cranial nerves. This is the inferior view of the brain. I can see frontal lobe, temporal lobe, I can easily locate them. I see the two cerebellar hemispheres. I can see midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And that would be pituitary gland. We know that exactly above pituitary gland, deep inside, we should find hypothalamus. What I do, I start with this structure that is called olfactory bulb. Recall in the superior part of the lining of nasal cavities, we have olfactory epithelium. That would be the origin of olfactory nerves, cranial nerve number 1. And when the axons of olfactory nerves get exactly to olfactory bulbs, here those axons form synapse with the second group of neurons. And then from olfactory bulbs, we do have olfactory tract that they send the olfactory signals. If you follow this, you see we are going to the medial section of temporal lobe, simply because olfactory cortex is located in the medial of temporal lobe. These two are optic nerves, cranial nerves number 2. They are sending visual signals from retina of the eye to the brain. When we get exactly here, a very small percentage of each optic nerve crosses and goes to the opposite side. We name this place optic chiasm. And then after optic chiasm, visual signals will be sent to thalamus. And please note that the final destination would be the occipital lobes, because primary visual cortex would be located in occipital lobes. So far I have found cranial nerves number 1 and cranial nerves number 2. When I get to midbrain, when we have a closer view of midbrain, I can locate a cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, and cranial nerve number 4, trochlear. The reason that we see these pairs of cranial nerves very close to midbrain is because in midbrain we have the nuclei associated with these cranial nerves. When we get to pons, we can locate cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal, number 6, abducens, so these are the two abducens, number 7, facial, and number 8, vestibulocochlear. In pons, we do have the nuclei associated with these cranial nerves. In medulla oblongata, we do have nuclei that are associated with cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear, cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, number 10, vagus, number 11, accessory, and number 12, hypoglossal nerves. In separate videos, I'm going to discuss the major activities of each one of these cranial nerves. Hope you find this brief review of the major part of the brain, cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and diencephalon helpful.